So JavaScript has what we call objects. Objects are another data type in JavaScript that basically just allow us to organize code in ways that are practical. So, for example, think about a site like Facebook. You often hear people say, okay, Facebook has over 1 billion users, right? And so when they say the word user, they're referring to, in programming, what we call an object. Okay, and so every user at Facebook has properties like first name, last name, maybe a profile picture, an email address, and so on. So those are what we call properties for those user objects. And then each user can do certain things like post on a wall or upload, new profile pictures. Those are what we call methods. Okay, so those are functions essentially that users can do. So let's take a look at this. The way we can create a new object in JavaScript is simply by putting curly braces out like that. So an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. That's basically an object. It's an empty object in this case. So again, just like we have been with all the other data types, it's a good habit to place it inside a variable. So I could say variable, we can call it user, and just store that as an empty object, okay? So that's all we're doing here. Now, really quick, just to recap, when I say variable assignment, when we're doing this, all we're saying is in the browser's memory, okay, or in the computer's memory, let's reserve a piece of memory for this object here. In this case, it's just an empty object. And let's label it with the name here, in this case, user. So if I save that and I refresh here, you'll see anytime we use user, it really just translates into that particular thing that it was stored as, okay? So labels, these variable names are just a way to translate to what they actually, equal to. And it's just a good way to keep things organized. So that's kind of the theory behind it a little bit, just diving into it a bit. Now, we have these objects. Let's see what the object syntax looks like. In here, we can give our users a first name. And so look at this syntax. It's like this. You usually break objects out into multiple lines like this. And this is what we would call a property. It's very similar to a variable, except we use this colon syntax. And let's just give it a name. Okay, and then comma separate your properties. So we could do last name. And then we could do a method. Okay, and this is what we call a method. So these are properties because they're basically like variables, okay? All we're doing is kind of like variable assignment. We're saying inside of this object user, it has a first name and it's set to Joe. And it has a last name and that's set to Smith. Okay, and then it can do something. It can have a function. And we'll just do, we can put this in one line. Okay, and so the last property here, or in this case it's a method, and as you can see it's highlighted green, we don't need a comma if it's going to be the last thing that's in here. And then we just close it out with here. This is the opening curly brace, there's the closing curly brace. So this is a proper object right here. It's called a user object in our case. We just named it that. So now what I can do is in my code, I can go down here and basically say something like this. I can use this dot notation and output this to the console. Let's see what happens when we just log that out to the console. User.firstname. What do you think will happen? It's going to go in there and reach in and grab out that first name. So there we go. What we've basically done is we've just kind of namespaced some variables. We've organized some variables. Instead of storing a variable like this out in the open, what we've done is we've kind of categorized it under this object called user. Okay, and that's just the terminology. It's just called an object. And so now to get to that variable, we don't just write first name out in the open. We say user.firstname. And that's how we access this one right here. Okay, so The benefits of that you'll see down the line, but this is a really important concept to kind of grasp overall. So we can do things like that, and we can also invoke the methods much in the same way. We would do user.sayHello because we wrote that right up there. And keep in mind, to invoke it, you've got to have the parentheses next to it. So this would log out the word hello. I'm not going to wrap this inside a console.log method because it's already logging out to the console when we, created that function blueprint, if you will. So, and remember, we're used to seeing functions on separate lines. I just wanted to show you what it looked like in one line, but this is what it would look like on separate lines. Okay, so I know there's a lot going on. We've got colons, commas, but just let it sink in. Let that format kind of sink in for objects. So if I run this, there you go. It's logged out hello. So objects can have properties again. These are basically like variables that are sitting inside this curly brace here and the closing one. And they can have methods. That means they can do things. Think of them like verbs. Okay, it's the verb of the object. It can do something. It can say hello. That's what a function does. And when we have a function inside of an object, we just call it a method. Now, likewise, we can add more properties or methods to our object just simply by doing something like this. User dot, we'll say email is equal to whatever, just some random email address. Okay, and so now this has been added to this object. We're not quite seeing it out here in our text editor. It's not going to like pop up again and say, okay, now user has this additional email property, which is equal to test@example.com, right? We're not going to see that, but that's essentially what's happening. We're basically getting another one of these and storing it in here like that. So you just have to kind of use your imagination. When you're adding it in like that, that's all we're doing. With this equal sign, we're adding one more element or one more property to this. And we can add a function if we want or a string. Let's add both. So we've added an email address. Let's add another method. We'll say and notice how we kind of write this all out. We'll just say, this time we'll use the alert method. Okay, and we need to put a semicolon here because there's an equal sign here. So we've just written out two commands. We said, okay, for this user object right here, which again, remember, objects are just defined with that curly brace open and close. Inside of it, let's go ahead and add another property, email, and have it go inside here. And then let's also add another method this time, and it's going to do this, alert by. Okay, so now I'm going to save it and refresh. And again, we're not seeing anything new. We're not console logging anything here. But now if I type out user here, watch what happens. You can see it's got all those properties in there. It got the email property we added. So again, you're not going to see the result in your text editor, obviously, when you add it. But in the computer's memory, we've now added more properties and methods to that object. So again, play around with that and let that sink in. But that's how we can create objects and then add things to them as well.